Welcome to Preeminent Test Prep. Today is day 20 in our 90-day SAT prep series. So today we're going to be working with 30 minutes out of the math section, and then we're going to spend 30 minutes with the SAT writing section. So as far as with the math section today, we're going to be going through problems 16 through 20 of SAT Practice Test 1 for the Math No Calculator section, and then we're going to go through problems 16 through 23 of the Math with Calculator section. So really focusing in on giving you guys tips, tricks, and advice as far as how to get to the correct answer the fastest. But in this point in time, we're really more focused with accuracy than with pace. We'll work a lot more on moving faster as we get into later weeks, but for now it's really about teaching you how to get to the right answer, right? And part of that will be teaching you tricks where it's going to help you improve your speed, but for now really focusing in on accuracy. So with that, let's go and get started with the math section for today. So we got no calculator questions 16 through 20. So 16 through 20 of the no calculator section, we have to come up with our own answer. So we're not going to be able to use tricks where we just get rid of wrong answer choices here. We have to actually understand how to solve it. So right here, I notice I have if t is greater than 0. So anytime that I have an if statement, I want to circle it or underline it or square it, pay attention to it because it's going to be important. If I ever see that my if statement includes my variable being greater than 0 or less than 0, really what that indicates to me is that it's going to have to be, in this case, positive, right? If t is greater than 0, it's got to be positive. If it were to say if t is less than 0, it would have to be negative. In this case, it has to be positive, so I'll put a p for positive. Then I have t squared minus 4 equals 0. What is the value of t? All right, so right here, I'm just going to add 4 to each side to get t on one side set equal to a constant. So I have t squared equals 4. I square root each side to get rid of my squared there. Square root of 4 is going to be plus or minus 2. In this case, since t has to be greater than 0, we must have that plus 2, okay, because negative 2 would be less than 0. So my answer right there for the value of t is going to be 2, right? So I would just bubble that into my answer sheet. So as far as tips there, we're just paying attention to our if statement and then setting our variable equal to a constant and then solving for the value of t. All right, 17. I'm guessing I have to solve for x, right? I just look down here, I see what is the value of x. All right, so in order to do that, I'm going to need to understand what the lengths are. So I have a summer camp counselor wants to find length x in feet across a lake as represented by the sketch above. The lengths AB, EB, BD, and CD on the sketch were determined to be 1800. So AB is going to be 1800. EB is going to be 1400. 700 is going to be BD. And that's actually all I'm going to need. I don't even need that, or I guess I do. And then DC is going to be 800. All right, so I'm asked to solve for x now. Well, one thing I notice right off the bat is these angles have to be the same, right? Anytime we have angles like this, they have to be the same. So I know that those are going to be the same. The next thing I notice is that from B to D, right, that corresponds to B to E, okay? So those two, I see that the ratio of BE over BD, I see that that's 1400 over 700, which is 2 to 1, which is 2 to 1. So I know then that every single side length, and keep in mind that since I know that this angle here is the same as this angle here, and this angle here is the same as this angle here, I know that these angles also have to be the same. So I'm going to do a double right there, right? And I should do a triple here as well to show that it's not the same as that D there, right? So now I see that I have these similar triangles. So the thing about similar triangles is that the ratio of all their sides has to be the same. So since I have a 2 to 1 ratio from this side to this side, I have to have a 2 to 1 ratio from this side to this side. So since this is 800, I just have to double that, and that's going to give me 1600 over here. So my answer for the value of x is going to have to be 1600, right? And I'm going to slow down and kind of give you a bit more on that right now, just because I want you to really understand what I just did. So I saw that my angles right here around this B had to be the same. Then I saw that D and E have the same angle as well. So I already had my markers as far as what distances were which. So I knew that these were going to be similar triangles as well, since all their angles are the same. Anytime all the angles in a triangle are the same, they're similar, which means the ratios of their side lengths have to be the same. So then I saw that this 1400 over the 700 means that we're going to have a double whatever amount is on a side length here to whatever its corresponding amount over on this triangle here is going to be. So then I took that 800, multiplied it by 2, and got 1600 for x. So that's going to be 1600 feet. So you're not going to have to put feet in your answer. You just have to put your number and your bubble sheet. So that's going to be 1600 for x. All right, 18. Or as far as tips for what you should put in your notes for this one, what I'd really recommend putting in your notes is just look at how much I annotated this this diagram here. Anytime you have diagrams, make sure you're annotating it, Especially, I'm going to erase this real quick, so if you want to see that, go back and pause it. Especially anytime you have similar shapes like this or anything like that, what I really would like for you to do is identify angles that are the same. So put 2 dashes here, those are the same. 3 dashes here, because those are going to be the same. Right? And then if you wanted to as well, you could put a line here and a line here to indicate those are the same length. Put 2 lines there, put 2 lines here, put 3 lines here, and 3 lines here. Or I guess they're not the same length, but they're just corresponding. Okay, so in this case, they're corresponding. They're not the same length, but that way you could at least see which ones are corresponding to each other. So if you wanted to do that, you could. They're not going to be the same length, but they are going to correspond as far as ratios go. So really just annotating up diagrams, that's what I would highly recommend. Also, I recommend that if you're given units in feet and you have a diagram like that, I recommend going ahead and putting it out onto that diagram. So in this case, we had 1800, we had 700, 800, all of that. I'd recommend putting that on your diagram as well. All right, 18. According to the system of equations above, what's the value of x? Okay, one thing I'm immediately looking at is I have a stacked equations. I talked about this before, but I'm going to look to add or subtract to get rid of the variable that I don't need. So in this case, I'm asked for the value of x, so I'm going to look to add or subtract y to get rid of it. I see I have 2y here and I have a y up here, so what I'm going to look to do is I'm going to look to double my top equation, so I'm going to multiply all of it by 2. Then I'll have 2y, and then I can subtract this 2y down here to get rid of my y. So that's what I'm going to do. So I have 2y minus 2y, that's going to give me 0y. I'm going to have 2x minus x, which will leave me with x. And then I'll have this 2 times negative 9 is going to give me negative 18. So I have negative 18 minus negative 25, which will turn it into a plus 25. So negative 18 plus 25 is going to give me 7, and I see that x will equal 7. So my answer for 18 will be 7. So as far as tips to put in your notes, I talked about this before, and I'm going to say it again. Anytime that we see a stacked equations like this, we're always looking to add or subtract to get rid of the variable we don't need every single time. Some other times it'll say something like what's the value of x plus 1, and sometimes you'll be able to add or subtract to get that, or what is the value of x plus 3y, right? And you'll be able to add or subtract to get something like that. But either way, anytime we have stacked equations, that's what we're looking to do, add or subtract to get to our answer. All right, 19. 19 has something I definitely want you to put in your notes. So in a right triangle, one angle measures x, right? X in degrees, where sine of x is equal to 4/5. What is cosine 90 minus x? This is going to be 4/5. So how did I know that so quickly without showing any work? Okay, something you should know is that if we were to draw this out, okay, we have our angle x, we'll call it right here. The angle 90 minus x, since it's a right triangle, is just going to be this angle over here. We're going to call it y. So we'll call this cosine y. Okay, so if we're looking at this, it says the sine of x is 4/5. We know that the sine is the opposite over the hypotenuse. Okay, so the opposite of this x would be right here. That's going to be 4, and our hypotenuse will be 5 here. Well, what's the cosine of y then? Well, the cosine of y is going to be our adjacent over our hypotenuse. Well, we see its adjacent is 4, and its hypotenuse is 5, so it's also going to be 4/5. So how did I recognize that without drawing the triangle? Well, anytime that we have sine of an angle, and then we're asked for the cosine of the complementary angle, or the angle that adds to 90 with it. So in this case, the angle that adds to get to 90 with it, right? Anytime that we have that, and I said complementary, I think complementary is the one that adds to 90, but just know that I'm talking about the angle that adds to 90 with it. Anytime we have sine of an angle, right, and then we have cosine of the other angle that would add with it to get to 90, it's going to be the same ratio. Okay, so just understand that that'll be the same ratio. So I would put this in your notes. I'd put this sine of x equals 4/5, and then I'd put cosine 90 minus x equals 4/5, just so you understand that the sine of any angle, whatever it equals, it will also be the same as the cosine of the opposite angle, right? Opposite angle meaning it's complementary, right? So the other angle that adds with it to get 90, not opposite in sign, but just the other angle that adds with it to get 90. All right, question 20. If a is equal to 5 times root 2 and 2a is equal to the square root of 2x, what's the value of x? Okay, well, this is 2a here, right? So I have to double what a is equal to. So 2a then is going to equal 2 times 5 times root 2. So that's going to give me 10 root 2, right? And I know that that is equal to the square root of 2x. So now at this point, I can just go ahead and square each side, square it, square it. I get 2x is going to equal 10 squared, that's 100. 100 times this 2 times this root 2, or I'm sorry, this squared times this root 2, that gets rid of my square root. Now I have 2 times 100, that's going to give me 200. I divide each side by 2, and I see that x will equal 100. So my answer there is going to be 100. All right, so one thing that you really could have noticed here is that problems 16 through 20, they're actually easier than problems 12 through 15, in my opinion. And I think overall, if you look at all 10 practice tests that have been released by the College Board, I think you really start to see that questions 16 through 20 are oftentimes significantly easier than problems 11 through 15 or 10 through 15 are, right? And that's because you have to come up with your own answer choice. And it's not that that's an advantage, it's just that the way that the SAT's set up as a test, right? They have easier questions at 16, 17, and 18 than they have at 12 through 15. So we'll talk more about strategy as far as which problems you should answer first in later sections, but just understand if you're taking your next practice test and you get stuck at a question at 12, understand it's okay to skip to 16, 17, and 18 because those are easier questions historically than are questions 12, 13, 14, and 15. So moving on to that free response section can be advantageous if you're stuck on questions such as 13, 14, and 15, because 13, 14, and 15 are more than likely going to be harder than 16, 17, 18, 19, right? So understanding that 16, 17, and 18 are really about equivalent in difficulty to questions like 1 through 8 or 1 through 9 as far as the multiple choice section. So understanding that you want to get to those easier questions before you do those more difficult ones to maximize your points. But we'll talk more about that later on. All right, we got to get down to section 4 here. Section 4, so we haven't covered question 16 and some of the other practice tests we did on this one just because it was looped to 15 and 16. But in the coming days, we'll do 16 as well because we haven't done that one on everyone. But we already did that one for this one. So let's get started with 17 then. So the complete graph of the function f is shown in the xy plane for what value of x is the value of f of x at its minimum. So f of x being at its minimum, I don't know why it just erased that. So f of x being at its minimum occurs right here, right? I don't know why this is doing this. All right, hang on a minute. So f of x being at its minimum we see is at right there, okay? So we see that that's at -3. So we have -1, -2, -3. So the value of x when f of x is at its minimum is going to be b, -3. As far as tips for that, just once again, notice how I annotate my graph, right? I circled where it is, drew these things. Anytime you have a graph or a table, be sure to annotate it. It's going to help you not make a stupid mistake. So that's really a big tip there. 18, I've got two sets of inequalities in the xy plane of 0, 0 is a solution. Okay, if statements. If statements are important. Pay attention to any time there's a statement that says if, because it's probably important to being able to solve your question. So highly recommend paying attention to if statements. I would put that in your notes. Always underline them or circle them, something like that. Which of the following relationships between A and B must be true? Well, in this case, since 0, 0 is a solution, I can just plug in zeros for each of these and see what it says, right? So in this case, I see A has to be greater than 0. So A has to be greater than 0, which means A has to be positive. And I see that B has to be less than 0. So B has to be less than 0. So B's got to be less than 0, A's got to be greater than 0. So A has to be positive, B has to be negative, therefore A has to be greater than B, and my answer there is going to be A for 18. All right, so as far as tips for that one, once again, really just notice how important this if statement was, right? If you didn't read this if statement, you would kind of be lost trying to solve this. You would be lost trying to solve this. It'd be very difficult. So just paying attention to those if statements is just really, really crucial in my opinion. So anytime you see the word if on the math section, highly recommend squaring whatever it's talking about, underlining it, circling it. I would really put that in your notes, and I'd stress that as a strategy to pay attention to if statements. All right, 19. We have a food truck sells salads for $6.50 each and drinks for $2 each. The food truck's revenue from selling a total of 209 salads plus drinks in one day was $836.50. How many salads were sold that day? All right, one thing I want to stress, okay, I would put this in your notes. Okay, there's going to be two different ways to solve this. One way is going to take you about 3 times longer, in my opinion. The other way will save you time. Okay, the way that's going to take you 3 times longer here is if you solve for drinks first. Okay, we want to solve for salads first, because if we solve for drinks first, then we have to go back through and solve for salads. And we don't want to do that because that's going to waste time. So we want to make sure we're solving for salads our first time. So notice how I said 209 is equal to S plus D. That's because I saw we had 209 salads, or 209 salads and drinks were sold in that day. So that means 209 is equal to the number of salads plus the number of drinks sold. Now our revenue is going to equal that $6.50 per salad S, right? That's an S, not a 5, plus our $2 per each drink, so plus 2D. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to substitute in my S for my D. So what I do here, and you'll see this type of question a fair amount on the SAT math section in my opinion. Most of the time it's on the calculator section. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to solve for what D is equal to. So I'm going to minus S from each side, and I'll have 209 minus S equals D. So I just plug that in for D. That 209 minus S. Okay, I'm going to have minus 2S. So I have 6.5S minus 2S. That's going to leave me with 4.5S. All right, that's an S, not a 5. Then I have this 2 times 209. That's going to give me 418. I'll subtract that from each side. Right now this is gone. Subtract 418. Let me get my calculator real quick. Okay, so we're going to have 836.50 minus 418. That's going to give us 418.5, and then we're going to divide that by 4.5. So that'll give us 418.5. Then we're going to divide that by 4.5, divide each side by 4.5, and we'll see that S is going to equal, S will equal 93. So 93 is going to be our answer for S, right? So notice how by solving for S, I didn't have to go back through and then I didn't have to find D, right? I didn't have to deal with it. If I was to solve for the number of drinks first, then I have to go back through and I would have to use that 209 equals S plus D, which it's not a huge deal, but on the SAT math section, since it's timed, you really want to save as much time as possible, and having to do that step is going to waste time because there's a faster way to solve it, and I only want to teach the fastest ways to solve things. So anytime you have a system of equations like this where you have two variables, make sure you solve for the variable you need first. Don't waste time solving for the other one because you don't get points for that. All you should care about with the SAT sections is getting points. And we don't get points for solving the number of drinks. We get points for solving the number of salads. So solve for the number of salads first. All right, so that's going to be B, 93 for 19. All right, now we can move on to number 20. Also, just another thing, notice how I set up my equations as I read through. That's something I recommend as well. All right, question 20. We have Alma bought a laptop at a computer store that gave a 20% discount off the original price. The total amount she paid to the cashier was P dollars, including an 8% sales tax on the discounted price. Which of the following represents the price of the computer in terms of P? The original price. Okay, so we got to solve for our original price. Well, we know the price we paid is going to equal our original price, which I'm going to use theta just because original, but I don't want to use an O because it looks like a 0. So this is going to represent our original price, is that symbol right there. Well, our original price has to get multiplied by 0.8, right, since we have a 20% discount off its original price. So by multiplying by 0.8, we're taking that 20% discount off. The next thing we see is we have an 8% sales tax. So that means we have to multiply by 1.08 because that 8% sales tax means we have to pay the full price represented by this 1 plus that 8%. So that's going to be that 1.08. Okay, now all we have to do is solve for this symbol here. We do that by dividing each side by 0.8 times 1.08. Okay, we do that to each side, and we get our answer right here. All right, we see that that answer is choice D. Okay, so that's how you're going to solve for 20. As far as things I'd recommend putting in your notes, just understanding that we write down our equation as we see it, and then also sometimes you're going to have to make up a symbol. Okay, there are times when you need to make up a symbol. In this case, we needed the original price, and we weren't given a symbol for that. That's okay, just make one up. Make up a symbol, and then solve for it. So that's one thing you can put in your notes as well. Don't feel like you have to only use the symbols you're given. You can always make up one if you need to. All right, now we've got a data table. Dreams recalled during 1 week, group X, group Y. The data in the table were produced by a sleep researcher studying the number of dreams people recalled when asked to record their dreams for 1 week. Group X consists of 100 people who observed early bedtimes. Group Y, 100 people who observed later bedtimes. If a person is chosen at random, that's what I was looking for there. I wanted to make sure it was at random. From those who recalled at least one dream. Okay, anytime you're dealing with a table or a graph, anything like that, always pay attention to words such as at least, no more than, less than, anything like that that can give you an idea of what you're looking for. Always pay attention to those things and underline them or circle them. Okay, so if you're chosen at random, from those who recalled at least one dream, so we're not considering those who didn't call any, so we can get rid of that. What is the probability the person belonged to group Y? Well, we need to take our total from group Y, and we need to break it down. So our total from group Y out of our total who were called one or more dreams. Okay, so that's going to be this right here is going to be n for numerator. Okay, and then our denominator is going to be the sum of these two is going to give us our denominator. So 68 plus 11 will give us 79 in our numerator, and then in our denominator we're going to have that 79 plus whatever's up here. 28 plus 57 will give us 85. So that's going to be 79 plus 85 is going to be our denominator. 79 plus 85. I'm just going to check if there's an answer choice that's right around there. I see we have these ones are over 100. I know my denominator's got to be more than 100 looking at that, but it's going to be less than 200. I see I have a 79 up top. I see C will be my answer there. So notice how I didn't plug it in my calculator or take time solving for 79 plus 85. I just did rough math, saw it couldn't equal 100 or 200 in the denominator, and found answer choice C. So don't always feel like you have to take time to solve for everything exactly. As long as you're very, very confident, like I was, that it's not going to equal 100 or 200 in the denominator, then you're all set to go ahead and solve. So don't waste time. Just make sure that you're getting to the right answer fairly quickly with the SAT math section. All right, we're going to go to question 23 today, so we got two more here. So let me just make sure we've answered all of them. Looks like we have questions 22 and 23. We've got the annual budget for different programs in Kansas from 2007 to 2010. So which of the following best approximates the average rate of change? Okay, average rate of change means we're going to take our change in whatever our dependent variable or whatever our y is, we're going to divide it by our change in our x, right? So change in the annual budget for agriculture / natural resources in Kansas from 2008 to 2010. So keep in mind, it's 2008 to 2010, not 2007. So agriculture and natural resources, 2008 to 2010. I see this as a difference of 2. So 2 will be in my denominator, 2 years. And I see that we increased by, it looks like about 130,000. So 130,000 over 2. Okay, and I know that that's going to be just about 60,000, or I'm sorry, 65,000. So the answer there is going to be 65 million. I'm sorry, 65 million. So my answer there is going to be B. All right, question, or as far as tips for that one, just understand average rate of change, basically just change in your dependent variable divided by your change in independent variable. Your independent variable here was time, dependent was amount spent per year. And then also paying attention to your dates, okay? So sometimes it'll be your first date. In this case, it was not. So we had to pay attention to the fact that it was 2008 to 2010. So really just making sure we're really paying close attention to what our question is asking. It's very, very important. All right, question 23. Of the following, which program's ratio of its 2007 budget to 2010 budget is closest to the human resources program's ratio of its 2007 to 2010 budget? All right, well, I'm going to go find what my ratio for my HR department is from 2007 to 2010. I see it's just about 4 over 6, which is just about 2/3. So I'm going to look for another ratio of 2/3 from our 2007 budget to our 2010. So I see in agriculture and resources, it's not close to 2/3, right? It's about 38, and that's about 48, which is not close to 2/3. I see in education, it is about 2/3 because it's about 21 over 30, which is just about 2/3. So education right now is my top choice. I'll quick check the others. These two are way too close. Highways and transportation, also way too close. Public safety, this is about a double from this 2007 to 2010. So that is not going to be 2/3 either. So my answer there is going to be education. All right. So one thing to note is that when I was dealing with this table, notice how I never even used a calculator. There's times on the SAT math section where a calculator is absolutely necessary, and there's times when it's quicker to not use one. So I really have only used a calculator, I'd say, on maybe 4 of these questions so far as 1 through 23 as we've gone through these things. You'll notice I don't use a calculator a whole lot, and that's kind of strategic, right? We don't want to be wasting time plugging things into our calculator if we don't have to. Okay, because if we're looking at our calculator to type in numbers, we're not looking at the test, and we're only getting points for what we answer on the test. So we don't want to waste too much time looking down at our calculator. So that's just something that I want you to pay attention to, is that I'm not using a calculator a whole lot here, right? And that's strategic. It's not by accident. I have one on me. I used it for one of the questions earlier, but I think I've only used it for 1 or 2 today, maybe. I can go check real quick. I used it for 19. And that was it. So I only used it on 1 for the math section as a whole today. So just understand that. But all right, so that takes us through the math section for today. We'll go ahead and switch over to the writing section for today. All right, let's get started with today's writing section. So for today, we're going to be doing about 22 questions. We're going to do questions 23 to 44 from SAT Practice Test 3. So as I go through, I'll really be teaching you what I look for in the SAT writing section, tips, tricks, advice, insights, strategies, everything like that. So all of that should go in your notebook. So really kind of trying to take it slow for today and kind of just show you what to look for. So we'll start worrying more about pacing in a couple weeks, but for now we're really focused on accuracy and teaching you what to look for on the SAT writing section in order to make sure that you're getting them correct before we start worrying about speed. But there will be tricks that'll help you with speed as we go through as well. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with our first passage. How do you like those apples? Marketed as Smart Fresh, the chemical 1-MCP, 1-methylocyclopropene, has been used by fruit growers since 2002 in the United States and elsewhere to preserve the crispiness and lengthen the storage life of apples and other fruit, which often must travel long distances before being eaten by consumers. Okay, right here I have two sentences underlined. We have the underline going through this comma, so I know I'm probably going to be asked to combine the sentences. I can quick check that in my question. Which choice most effectively combines the sentences? So in these cases, whenever I'm asked to combine sentences, what I'm going to do, right, this is just basically, I just call it a sentence combination question. What I'll do is I'll read through my two sentences, and then I'll kind of figure out my own guess as to how it should be constructed and look for which one applies that in my answer choices A through D. All right, so we have 1-MCP lengthened storage life by 3 to 4 times when applied to apples. This extended life allows producers to sell their apples in the off-season months after the apples have been harvested. Okay, so here's a couple of things as far as sentence combination questions. So number one, it's got to be grammatically correct. Okay, so number one thing is going to be if it's grammatically correct. Okay, these are the things that we need in order for our answer to be correct. It has to be grammatically correct. It should follow a sequential order, right? Follow a logical order. So follow a logical order. And then the third thing that we want to watch out for is modifiers. So a lot of time in sentence combination questions, we have modifiers, and we want to make sure that they're modifying what they're supposed to be. Okay. We also want to make sure our modifiers are placed at the right place in the sentence in order to give it the following that logical order as well. All right. So if we're going to look at this, what we're really thinking is we want to follow our order of what happens here, right? So we're going to apply our 1-MCP to apples. That's going to lengthen our storage life, which allows them to be sold months after harvest. Okay, so we're going to look for an answer choice that has that. We have A, when applied to apples, 1-MCP lengthens storage life by 3 to 4 times, allowing producers to sell their apples in the off-season months after the apples have been harvested. Yes, that's perfect. We have our modifier, which is modifying correctly 1-MCP. That's what's being applied to the apples. So our modifier is good there. We know we follow a logical order because we talk about lengthening storage life, which allows those producers to sell their apples in the off season. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what's wrong with B, C, and D real quick. So for B, we have producers are allowed to sell their apples months after they've been harvested. That doesn't follow a logical order because we're starting with what happens last, so it's not sequential. So that's why B is wrong. C, 1-MCP lengthens storage life when applied to apples by 3 to 4 times, allowing producers to sell their apples months after the apples have been harvested in the off season. Okay, so here's the big problem with this is we are talking about it being applied to apples after it's being lengthening the storage life, right? So that's our error there, is that those two things need to be switched places. We're applying it to apples and that's lengthening storage life, so we want to have that in the correct order there, and C does not have it in the correct order. D, months after the apples have been harvested, producers are allowed to sell their apples. Once again, that's out of order as well. All right, and at a cost of about 1 cent per pound of apples, 1-MCP is a highly cost-effective treatment. However, 1-MCP is not a panacea for fruit producers or sellers. There are problems and limitations associated with its use. Okay, I see a 1 here. Anytime that I have a 1 or any number, I know I'm going to be asked about placing some sentence somewhere. So I'm going to go down and find that question first so I don't have to reread my whole paragraph to place it. So here I'm asked where sentence 4 should go, so I go through and read sentence 4 first. Keep in mind if there's a question in sentence 4, I answer that as well as I read it. So we have, but some fruits do not respond as well to 1-MCP as others do. Okay, I want to match this do here, create that parallelism. Okay, so I need to match that do, so I can go ahead and answer 28 real quick. 28 will be answer choice B. Okay, so we have, but some fruits do not respond as well to MCP as others do, and some even respond adversely. All right, so I want to see a transition, so I want to see a contrast before this, and then I want to see after it that I'm talking about fruits that respond adversely to 1 MCP. That should come after. Okay, so anytime I'm asked to place a sentence, I'm going to read it and I want to come up with what I think should come before it and what should come after it. All right, so that's what I got right there. So now I'm going to go ahead and read through and place it. So we have 1 MCP works by limiting a fruit's production of ethylene, a chemical that causes fruits to ripen and eventually rot. We don't want to do comma it is because then we have a comma splice because this is an independent clause, and if we have it is, then this is an independent clause. So we want to get rid of it is. Same with that is, right? And then being also doesn't work there. We just want to remove it because it's unnecessary. By placing this comma after ethylene, we know that we are referring by limiting a fruit's production of ethylene, a chemical. Yeah. So by placing this comma after ethylene, this sentence here, or not sentence, but this dependent clause, it's going to modify this ethylene, right? We know it'll describe it, so we don't need to say it is being or that is. We can just say a comma and then say a chemical that causes fruits to ripen and eventually rot. So that's something that you should know as well. We can just delete that right there. All right, well, 1 MCP keeps apples tight and crisp for months. We wouldn't describe apples as tight, so that's going to be wrong. We also wouldn't describe apples as stiff or taut, but we would describe them as firm. In this case, firm is the only one that is really applicable to describe an apple. So there's some questions like that where you have to just pick the word that is the only one that you could use to describe something, and only one will be the answer, right? There can't ever be two. All right, and crisp for months, it also limits their scent production. Okay, so what's this question asking? This one's all about pronouns. Okay, so this one's about matching our pronouns. We know that this there is referring to this apples, so our answer there is going to be no change because we have to keep them both plural. Okay, they both have to be plural. Apples is plural, so there has to be the plural pronoun there. We also have to use the correct there, which is going to be THEIR. That's the pronoun version. All right, question 27, we'll work our way down. This may not be much of a problem with certain kinds of apples that are not naturally very fragrant, such as Granny Smith, but for apples that are prized for their fruity fragrance, such as Macintosh, this could be a problem with consumers who will reject apples lacking the expected aroma. If we're going to have a comma after some sort of a people or a place, right, and then have a comma, we're going to want to use who if it's a person or a group of people. Okay, if it's a place, we're going to want to use where. Right, we'd do a comma and where. If it was a time, we would say comma when, anything like that, right? We want to use that comma and then what it's describing. So in this case, it's a person, which is a who. So we want to use a comma and then say who will reject apples. So we'll go down. We see that that's answer choice D for 27. All right, and then we already answered 28 as being due, and we can go ahead and move on. Or I'm sorry. So as far as placing our sentence 4, so we wanted to find a place where before it we indicate a contrast and then start talking about fruits that respond adversely, right? And we see that that happens right here. Okay, we say it also limits their scent production. Okay, so that is where we start talking about adverse effects, right? Limiting scent production. So that's what we wanted to come after our sentence. So our sentence needs to be placed in between 1 and 2. So before 2 or after 1 is what I'm looking for as my answer choice. I see I have B after sentence 1, so that'll be my answer for 30. Okay, so that correctly places my adverse effects, which I talk about in sentence 4, right at the end. Some respond adversely before discussions of adverse effects such as scent being limited, right, which can be a problem with apples such as Macintosh. All right, furthermore, some fruits, particularly those that naturally produce a large amount of ethylene, do not respond as well to 1 MCP treatment. Take Bartlett pears, for instance. Okay, this could be an independent clause, right? And then what comes after it, we have unless they are treated with exactly the right amount of 1 MCP at exactly the right time, they will remain hard and green until they rot, and consumers who experience this will be unlikely to purchase them again. Right? That's illustrating this take Bartlett pears, for instance. Okay, we're illustrating the idea of them not responding well to 1 MCP treatment, right? We're taking that idea, we say take Bartlett pears, for instance, which is an independent clause, and then we're illustrating that idea. When we illustrate an idea and we have 2 independent clauses, we can use that colon to connect them. So that's what we're going to do here, is we're going to use that colon to connect them. We can't use A or C because we have a comma splice, and we don't want to use D because as long as this second independent clause is illustrating the first, we want to connect it with a colon, not a comma. A colon. As long as the second independent clause is illustrating the first, we want to use that colon right there. So our answer there is going to be B. All right, now we've gotten through all of those. We can go ahead and move on to our next paragraph. Finally, researchers have found that 1 MCP actually increases susceptibility to some pathologies in certain apple varieties. For example, Empire apples are prone to a condition that causes the flesh of the apple to turn brown. Traditionally, apple producers have dealt with this problem by leaving the apples in the open air for 3 weeks before storing them in a controlled atmosphere with tightly regulated temperature, humidity, and carbon dioxide levels. As the graph shows, the flesh of untreated apples that are first stored in the open air undergoes, okay, anytime I see percentages or anything as far as a number and we're talking about a graph, I know I'm probably going to be asked to interpret a graph, right? And the big point with interpreting graphs is you have to make sure you provide an accurate interpretation. So with the SAT writing section, when you're asked to refer to a graph, it's almost always just to make sure that you put what's accurate according to the graph. So it's really about being able to interpret data in graphs and tables. For the SAT writing section, you have to be able to do that. So let's go ahead and get some practice doing that. So one thing that I recommend, right, before we go to the graph, let's understand what we're going there looking for. So I'm going to find what I'm looking for before I go to that graph. So I have, as the graph shows, the flesh of untreated Empire apples that are first stored in the open air undergoes, and then I have to have some quantitative measurement there, versus the flesh of untreated Empire apples that are immediately put into storage in a controlled environment. So I'm going to look to compare those stored in open air versus those stored in a closed container environment. So I'm going to go to my graph and find that. I see that my graph is going to be down here. So I'm looking at those that were untreated, so that's going to be my gray box. And then I'm looking at those placed in a controlled atmosphere versus those left in the open. Okay, I see that there's a big difference between those that are placed in a controlled atmosphere and those that are placed in open air, right? We have a difference of about 45% there. So I'm going to look for an answer choice that says something like that. Okay, I have A, no change, which says only 5%, so that can't be right. I have B, slightly more browning, but there's a lot more. I have a C, twice as much browning, but it was more like 10 times. And then I have D, substantially less browning, and that's going to be my answer there. So 31 has to be D, substantially less browning, because that is what is accurate according to the graph. All right, 32. Which choice offers an accurate interpretation of data in the graph? So once again, talking about that graph. So however, when Empire apples are treated with 1 MCP, what happens, right? Well, we have to find the accurate choice. Now in this case, it really looks like we're not given much to go on and look for. So we just kind of have to go through our answer choices here. So when Empire apples are treated with 1 MCP, so we're going to be using that black box, right? So we can actually go down here. We can take a look at that real quick. So now that they're treated with 1 MCP, we see that they're both very close to that 50% browning. So there's not very big of a difference. There's a slight edge in those that are placed in controlled atmosphere after 3 weeks. So we can use that to kind of find our answer here. So we have option A, their flesh turns brown when the apples are first stored in the open air, though not under other conditions. Well, they do turn brown under both conditions, so A is incorrect. B, roughly half of the flesh turns brown, regardless of whether the apples are first stored in the open air. Yes, right, we saw they were both just about 50%, which is going to be roughly half of that flesh turning brown, regardless of if they're stored first in the open air. So our answer for 32 has to be answer choice B, because that is accurate according to the graph. All right, now we've got question 33. So researchers, so it looks like our sentence starts back here. So we have, although researchers continue to search for the right combination of factors that will keep fruits fresh and attractive. And then we have the writer wants a conclusion that conveys the shortcomings of 1 MCP presented in the passage affects the actions of people in the fruit industry. Okay, this is the key part here. A lot of times with the last paragraph of an SAT writing passage, you'll be asked to do something with a last sentence or a closing thought or a closing sentence. And in those situations, you want to pay close attention to what you're asked to do with that closing thought. So in this case, we want to show how the shortcomings of 1 MCP are affecting the actions of people in the fruit industry. Okay, so we're really looking at producers in the fruit industry and how this is impacting them. So they're searching for the right combination of factors that will keep fruits fresh and attractive. The problem may be that consumers are overly concerned with superficial qualities. No, because we're not concerned with consumers right now. We're concerned with producers and how this is affecting their actions. B, many of the improvements to fruit quality they discovered so far have required trade-offs in other properties. No, we're not talking about trade-offs in other properties of the fruit. We need to be talking about actions, right? Actions of people in the fruit industry. That's the key part. B may be accurate in the passage, but it's not talking about the actions of people in the fruit industry, so B has to be incorrect. C, we have, for many fruit sellers must weigh the relative values of aroma, color, and freshness when deciding whether to use 1 MCP. Okay, here we're talking about fruit sellers, which is people in the fruit industry, so we've covered that part. Are we talking about their actions in response to the shortcomings of 1-MCP? Yes, because we're talking about how they're weighing the relative values of things, and they're making a decision, which is taking action, based on the shortcomings of 1-MCP, so as far as whether to use it. So C will be our answer for 33. All right, so we can go ahead. D, it must be acknowledged that 1-MCP, despite some inadequacies, has enabled some fruit industry to ship and store more fruit in ways than were impossible before. That one's going to be wrong because it's focusing too much on 1-MCP and doesn't talk about the actions of the producers. All right, let's go ahead and move on to passage 4 in this section. All right, sorry about that. I was interrupted. Let's get back into passage 4. All right, so we have more than one way to dress a cat, from Michelangelo's David to Vincent van Gogh's series of self-portraits to Grant Wood's iconic image of a farming couple in American Gothic, comma, works. Okay, how did I recognize that immediately for 34? Well, the thing is, when I saw from Michelangelo's David to Vincent van Gogh's series of self-portraits to Grant Wood's iconic image of a farming couple in American Gothic, I know that that's a dependent clause, not an independent clause. Okay, the key part that made me identify that is that we started with from. Okay, from is going to be a preposition. So if we're starting with that, then eventually I knew we were going to have that comma because we're starting with that dependent clause, right? From indicates to me I'm starting with a dependent clause. And if I'm starting with a dependent clause, in this case it's an introductory modifying clause, right? That is modifying these works, right? Not these works, right? And we can't use a semicolon here because what comes before it isn't an independent clause, so I can get rid of that. Can't use a period because this isn't an independent clause, and I cannot use no change also because this isn't an independent clause. My only option there is answer choice D because that takes this dependent clause, uses it to modify works, and then we have the works by human artists have favored representations of members of their own species to those of other species. So understanding that this is a dependent clause and therefore we can't use a period or a semicolon, therefore only answer choice left is answer choice D for 34. Right? Also it's modifying works, so we want to have that next to what it's modifying, and we don't need these here because it's modifying works. We use that comma and then allow it to modify it. All right, indeed, when we think about animals depicted in well-known works of art, the images of dogs playing poker, popularized in a series of paintings by American artist C.M. Coolidge. Okay, I know I have to have a dash here. So how did I know that? Well, when I saw that I have a dash here, I'm looking at one of two things. Okay, if I have a dash, I either want to see another dash, which tells me that this is a non-essential phrase or clause, in which case it can be offset with dashes, right? And if I use a dash here, I have to use a dash here if I'm doing a non-essential phrase or clause. So I either want to see that or I want to see a period. Those are really my only two options. I can't use a dash and a comma. That is not allowed. So I can get rid of A automatically because it used a dash with a comma. D just doesn't have one, right? And it has to have one because in this case it is non-essential because I could read, indeed, when we think about animals depicted in well-known works of art, the image of dogs playing poker may be the first and only one that comes to mind. See, we could skip everything in between these dashes and it still makes sense, so I know it's non-essential. And that's an easy way for you to see if something's non-essential and thus has to be offset with dashes or commas or parentheses, is if you can take it out and the sentence still makes sense. So since the sentence still made sense, I know that that is non-essential and it has to be offset with these dashes since I have a dash here. All right, so that's a big tip that you should recognize there. Anytime you see a dash or a parentheses or a comma, always be thinking in the back of your mind that it could be a non-essential phrase or clause and try to look for that and make sure that it's getting offset with the same thing that it started with. All right, yes, some of these earliest known works of art, including paintings and drawings tens of thousands of years old, found on caves and walls in Spain. Okay, this is going to have to be portrait. So how did I recognize that so quickly? Well, here's the thing, right? As I just said, we want to ignore things that are non-essential, right? This right here, including paintings and drawings tens of thousands of years old found on cave walls in Spain and France, is non-essential, as indicated by these commas right here. Okay, I could take all of that out and my sentence still makes sense. And since this right here, this question about portray, it's asking about tense, right? Whether or not we're in present, past, or future tense. And it's also asking about subject-verb agreement, so SV agreement. Okay, subject-verb agreement in number. Okay, so to determine that, there are a couple things I want to note here. Okay, we can ignore our non-essential phrase or clause here when determining subject-verb agreement and tense, so we'll ignore that. Then we go back here. Yet some of the earliest known works of art, I ignore of art because that's a prepositional phrase. So then I'm just going to have works, okay? So some of the earliest known works, this is plural, so I have to have a plural verb. My plural verb is going to be portray, okay? Because we would say they portray. So another trick to tell if something is a plural verb is to use they, right? What would you say with they? You'd say they portray. If we're going to test if something is singular, we'd say he portrays. He portrays. So that's singular, this is plural, and this is plural. Therefore, we know portray is going to be our plural verb there, right? And that's matching tense as well, since we have the use of present tense throughout this, right? So I'm going to erase that just so it doesn't clutter up the screen here. All right, so that's 36 is going to have to be C, portray. All right, so nor has artistic homage to our fellow creatures entirely died out in the millennia since. Okay, I'm told that the writer wants to link the first paragraph with the ideas that follow. Well, I need to know the ideas that follow then, so I can't answer this one yet. So I have to come back to 37. All right, next thing that I'm seeing is I'm seeing a 1 here, so I'm going to go find what I'm asked for as far as sentences. I see I have sentence 5. So to make the paragraph logical, sentence 5 should be placed where? All right, I'm going to read sentence 5. Continuing the tradition, Peter's daughter, Elizaveta, introduced the best and strongest cats in Russia to the Hermitage. Okay, I want to see Peter come before this then, since we're talking about his daughter. So before it, I want to see Peter. And then after it, we have introduced the best and strongest cats in Russia to the Hermitage. I want to be talking with something about the Hermitage after it then, with the cats. So I want to talk about something with cats and Hermitage after it, and I want to be talking about Peter before it. So that's how I'm going to place it. Keep in mind we still have to answer 37 as well. The State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, one of Russia's greatest art museums, has a long, productive partnership with a much-loved animal, the cat. For centuries, cats have guarded this famous museum, ridding it of mice, rats, and other rodents that could damage the art, not to mention scare off visitors. So how did I find that? Well, I used this damage here. This is telling me that I'm in the present tense, right? Damage art is scare off visitors. So I want to maintain tense. A great way to find out which tense you're in is just to look for other verbs that are in the same sentence or in this previous sentence. So in this case, I saw damage right here. That was a verb. I just matched the tense over here to scare. So we want to make sure we're matching tense within sentences. If you can't find another verb in your sentence, you can look to the sentence before or the sentence after. Usually that'll work. Not always though, so just be careful. But anytime that it's in the same sentence, most of the time you're just going to be able to go over and find that tense. So that one right there was damage. We pair that with scare. Keep them both in the present tense. All right, so we took scare off. At this point, I can kind of tell that we're going to be talking about a museum with cats. So I'm going to go back up to 37 and see if I can answer that. All right, so if we're linking that first paragraph, we got A, despite many years have passed between them and now. No, because we just talked about that. Died out in millennia since, right? That one doesn't cover anything with museum and cats. B, with special attention being paid to domestic animals such as cats. No, because that doesn't touch on our museum at all. C, even though most paintings in museums are people, not animals, once again, not touching on the fact that we're really talking about this museum in Russia. We're really focusing in on that area of the text. D, as the example of one museum in Russia shows, right? We're talking about the Hermitage and the cats there. We're being very specific to that one museum. All right, so 37 is going to be D. All right, we can move down. We're on 39, so we got to place this sentence. All right, right here I see I have Peter. That's a great sign as far as where I can place this then. Peter the Great introduced the first cat to the Hermitage in the early 18th century. Continuing the tradition, Peter's daughter, Elizaveta. So that's where I want to place that, right? We talked about how we wanted to have Peter before that sentence. Peter's in sentence 3. So we're going to want to place that C after sentence 3 for 39. Okay, so you see how helpful it is to go find your sentence first and read it, and then come up with what you want to see before it and after it, because then you're able to place it on your first read through and you don't have to read that whole paragraph twice. Because if you had to read all of this twice to place that sentence, that's going to waste a lot of time. So I always want to go to that sentence, find what comes before it and what comes after it, or what I think should come before it and what comes after it based on the sentence. And you can find clues within the sentence on literally every single question that I've seen where you have to place a sentence. And then I come up with what should come before it. I read through. When I find what comes before it, that's when I know where to place it. So in this case, that's after sentence 3 because I wanted to see Peter come before it. All right, so that's really a big tip to save time. The other problem is if you were to read through and you didn't know which sentence you had to place, you would read it out of order because one of the sentences is out of order, and then you're going to be really confused. So you always want to read that sentence first, right? Figure out which sentence has to be replaced because otherwise you're going to be reading it out of order and you're going to get confused. So this is the best way to approach these types of questions. So I highly recommend you put that strategy in your notes and adopt it in your practice tests and on the SAT. All right, today the museum holds a yearly festival honoring these faithful workers. These cats are so cherished by the museum That officials recently decreed original paintings? No, we don't decree original paintings, we commission them, okay? We commission paintings to be made, okay? We don't decree them. Decree would be like a law that is put in place by a king. We don't force them to be made either. We're not making people do them by force, so that's not a good word there. And we don't have to license it out, right? We're not licensing anything. Licensing would be something where you took a say like a brand logo, for example, like the Miami Heat, and you license it to be able to be put on jerseys, things like that. We're not licensing anything, but we're commissioning that, right? Commissioned in this sense means ordered. So this is kind of a words in context question a little bit, right? In this case, we're saying we are commissioning these paintings to be made. So in other words, we're ordering them to be made. In each, a cat is depicted upright in a human-like pose and clothed in imperial era Russia attire. The person chosen for this task, okay, digital artist Eldar Zakharov. Okay, that is going to be non-essential, right? Because I don't need it in my sentence, and I'll show you why. We have the person chosen for this task painted the cats in the style traditionally used by portrait artists. All right, that makes sense without digital artist Eldar Zakharov. So I know I'm going to need commas around that, right? The other thing that I notice is I have a comma here, and I don't need that, okay? I want to maintain no commas between digital artist Eldar Zakharov because that's one whole noun phrase. So I want to keep this right here with his name. So if you have an occupation or a label like this, you want to keep it with the name. You don't want to put a comma in between it. So I can go ahead and get rid of B because there's a comma there. I can get rid of A because there's a comma there. And now I see I'm between C and D. I need a comma before digital artist because the person chosen for this task is an introductory modifier that needs to be describing that noun phrase digital artist Eldar Zakharov. So if I have an introductory modifier, I need to have a comma after it. Okay, there's no way around that. So I have to have that comma after it. So my answer for 41 has to be answer choice D. So anytime you have an introductory modifying clause, and you can understand that just by seeing, in this case, it's the person chosen for this task, you would ask, who is that? Well, that's an indicator to you that you need to have this modifier, right? Who is that? That's the digital artist, Eldar Zakharov. So that's an indicator to you that that's going to be an introductory modifying clause. Then we want to keep this noun phrase together, right? We also noticed it was not essential, so we want to offset with commas. All right. In the style traditionally used by portrait artists, in so doing, we have presenting the cats as noble, worthy of respect. We're asked for which choice sets up the examples that follow. We need to know the examples that follow before we can say that. So one portrait, the Hermitage Court Chamber Herald cat, includes an aristocratic tilt of feline ears as well as a stately sweep of tail emerging from the stiff scarlet and gold of royal court dress. The wise, thoughtful green eyes of the subject of the Hermitage Court outrunner cat mimic those of a trusted royal advisor. All right, what I'm noticing there is that we're really talking about nobility and royalty. So I'm going to look for an answer choice that's talking about that for setting up those examples. Okay, so we have A, presenting the cats as noble individuals worthy of respect. Yes, because we're talking about nobility and royalty as far as how we're portraying these cats. B, managing to capture the unique characteristic of each cat. We're not doing that. We're really just comparing them to nobility and royalty. C, commenting on the absurdity of dressing up cats in royal robes. We're not commenting on the absurdity. D, indicating the cats were talented mouse catchers. Not even close. That's way off topic. All right, so 42 is going to be A. All right, we are down here. We've got some may find it, or at this point, the writer is considering adding the following sentence. The museum occupies 6 historic buildings, including the Winter Palace, a former residence of Russian emperors. No, we're not going to add it because that's off topic, right? So I'm going to look for something that says that, and that's going to be answer choice D. It provides background information irrelevant to the paragraph, right? So that's an off topic sentence. We're not going to put that in the middle of our sentence talking about these cats and their portrayal as royal advisors. All right, so 43 there is going to be D. Now we've got one last question. Some may find it peculiar to observe cats portrayed in formal court poses, but these felines, and then we're asked, no question, no prompt, so we're just probably matching tone here. But these felines, by mastering the art of killing mice and rats, are benefactors of the museum as important as any human. Okay, here's the problem with mastering the art of killing mice and rats. It doesn't touch on anything as far as the importance of these cats to the museum, which is really what this whole passage is really talking about, how important these cats are to the museum. So we want to end with something that's talking about that. So we're not going to use A because it doesn't touch on that. B, we're not going to use either because it just talks about being the lead predator in the ecosystem, not touching on the importance of it to the museum. C, also not touching on the importance to the museum. D, it does touch on the protection these cats provided the museum, protecting the museum's priceless artworks from destructive rodents. So that connects our passage all together and really shows us the big picture there. So D is going to be our answer for 44. All right, so thanks for watching today. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share. There will be a donation link in the description when it's up and running. Any private SAT tutoring I'm doing and college admissions consulting I'm doing will be linked in the description. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share, and have a good day.